Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Vanessa Byrne. I am co-chair of the real estate team in Mason, Hayes and Curran. I'm joined today by a very illustrious panel of people who I work with a lot in relation to nursing home transactions. Maureen.Bayley is Director of Healthcare in CBRE. Eimear Lyons is a Senior Associate in our corporate team here in Mason, Hayes and Curran. And Robert Dickson is Corporate Partner in Mason, Hayes and Curran. So why are we here today? I think actually the four of us have worked a lot together in different transactions over the last number of years, particularly the last 2 or 3 years. And I think has also led to consolidation in the sector. This is attracting interest from investors and operators, including those seeking yield and those who are interested in investing in trading assets. It has no doubt posed enormous challenges to the sector, and I think everybody has read a lot about that in the last number of months. But actually, these challenges have in the main been overcome, and now they've underlined the opportunities that there are in this sector. I'm going to hand over to Maureen now. Maureen's going to bring us through a really fascinating presentation, which I think you'll all find very interesting. Thank you, Maureen.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Mason, Hayes and Curran for inviting me to speak this morning. I'm delighted to be involved in this webinar. I'm going to take you through just the backdrop of the nursing home sector and what market trends are driving interest in this sector. First of all, if we look at demand, and I'm sure you've seen many iterations of this chart where you can see our population is growing at a fast rate, in particular our older population. So by 2051, we're going to have about 25% of our population will be over 65. Now, not all people over 65 require nursing home care, not at all. The ESRI says that around 4.5% of people may require residential care at some point. So that would point to a requirement for 45,000 nursing home beds in Ireland by 2030. And by 2051, that would require 72,000 beds. Now, we're quite a bit short of that at the moment. And that's where we talk about the undersupply that we have in Ireland going forward. So if we look then at the age profile in Ireland, and this map is a little bit misleading, but still quite interesting because it shows that a lot of the older people are in the West. And in actual fact, what it is that the average age is older in the west of Ireland. If you go on to the next one, then we look at this one shows where the age 80 number of population is concentrated. And in fact, there are pockets all around the country. In terms of supply then, we have in Ireland about 31,500 nursing home beds. Now, a quarter of those are in the public sector. That's not the focus of today. We're looking at the private sector. You can see an image there of a public sector traditional nursing home, and there's still, as I said, 25% of our beds in Ireland are in the public sector. We then have the private sector, which is made up of about 25,000 beds. 41% of those are now in group ownership, and I'll look at that a little bit more later. We have around 13% in the voluntary sector and 21% in the private sector owned by others, not groups. And you can see an image there of Four Ferns, one of the latest openings in Dublin in Foxrock. If you look at Ireland's nursing home bed stock then in terms of what is the stock is made up of. So if you look at the grey quadrants on the right, we have a lot of smaller stock, and by and large, a lot of those are older buildings, probably not purpose-built, probably not future-proofed. So if you look at the ones that have less than 40 beds, then less than 50, less than 60. Now, there are, of course, some very good nursing homes in the country that have less than 60 beds, but a lot of those within the grey quadrants are older and they're not future-proofed. If you look on the left-hand side then at the green quadrants, those are mainly, well, some of them, a lot of them, newer stock. There are quite a lot of quite large nursing homes over the 81 beds. We have 16% of our beds are within that category. If you look at the average across Ireland, then we have on average 58 beds per nursing home. Now we can compare that to other countries and we can look across Europe and the UK. It doesn't really, I mean, we can say that yes, Ireland sits somewhere between the UK and Spain, and that UK nursing homes tend to be a little bit smaller. It all depends what sort of regulatory framework you're working within. So comparing with the rest of Europe, we have to come back to HIQA and what we have here in Ireland and what the population makeup is and demand levels. If we look then at, when I talked about future proofing, and we talk about future proofing, we very much mean that the properties are generally purpose built, that they have single ensuite bedrooms, and you would hope to see not too many doubles, or as you can see there are still some triples and quadruples. The reason that single ensuite now has become even more important since COVID for infection control, we know that bathrooms are a huge spread of infection. So single ensuite, really any new builds that we're seeing, they are moving towards practically all single ensuite bedrooms. And I think that's what we're going to see going into the future. You may have a few doubles, but there are still, as you can see, 20% of the beds in Ireland are single without ensuite. There's 21% doubles, and there are still some quadruples and triples in some of the older homes. If we look at the population by county then versus the nursing home beds, you can see that most counties have, they've supply that ranges around 2 to 4%. The only county that shows as being slightly oversupplied is Kildare, and that is just in specific areas. And with all of these counties, we may see some stock close in the coming years. So we don't get too concerned about a little evidence of oversupply. If we correlate this data then, which is very interesting, with the change in population from 2011 to 2016 in the older age categories, that's where we see where the demand is going. So you can see Kildare there, which I mentioned, 32% increase in the older age categories from 2011 to 2016. So that's a huge jump. That's the highest that we see in the country. So all of this data then points to demand going forward. And I think we'll be informed even better when the next census is undertaken early next year. If we look at fair deal, then we can't mention the nursing home sector in Ireland without talking about fair deal. Obviously, there's a range across each county. We can draw on a county average, and the lowest you can see in the chart there is Donegal. The highest is Dublin. I'm not going to focus on this too much, but apart from to say that the country average now is at €1,012 per week. The weighted average is 1,043. But if we strip out Dublin, and then if we go another step further, we strip out Dublin, Wicklow, and Kildare, we get to a national average of about €951 per week. So any properties that we're looking at, one of the first things that a buyer will look at, what's the fair deal rate, what's the average in the county, what's the rate per week. If we look at HIQA then and the standards, because obviously this is controlling the sector, and if we look at the standards, when we talk about HIQA, we talk about standards, we're talking about the 2016 regs. Now they were brought in 2016, but there has been an extension to the 31st of December 2021 in terms of the time by which nursing homes in the private and public sector must comply with these standards. We've also been keeping a very close eye on any of the government documents that have come out since COVID-19 in particular. And you can see some of them here. There's been various iterations and drafts and finals. There's been a nursing home expert panel reference group set up, and there's been various publications that you can see there. We've been scanning from a property perspective to see, is there any mention of the removal of doubles, for example, or the insistence on a certain proportion of ensuite. Now we know that for new builds there are regulations in terms of the number and the percentage, but for existing nursing homes, as far as we can see, double bedrooms are still going to be tolerated. There may be a percentage brought in whereby there will be a tolerance for a certain amount. And if we look at the regulations then in terms of the 2021 deadline that I mentioned, December next year, the main themes that you can see across the regulations is it's in terms of, as I said, the percentage of single bedrooms versus doubles. It's about space in bedrooms, space in corridors, space for privacy and dignity of residents, space in double rooms, ensuite bathrooms, communal bathrooms, a lift, transfer of residents between amongst the building, and then the communal areas and recreational space. You can see there, it's down the bottom right-hand corner, 4 square meters per resident. If we think about existing homes now, and we think about building for the future, and we think about that in the context of the HIQA standards and in the context of what we've just seen from COVID-19, and it's not just COVID-19, it's general infection control. And by and large, Ireland, our regulations were quite good in terms of infection control within our healthcare settings. If you think about, as I said, managing existing homes and building for the future, you're thinking now about percentage of singles versus doubles. You're thinking about corridors, about the ability to segregate corridors, to isolate areas if there is a breakout of infection. You're looking at social distancing within communal areas, plenty of space for infection control, but also for, as I said, privacy and dignity of residents. You're talking about bathrooms and ensuite bathrooms, and you're talking about storage. Nursing homes never knew they needed as much storage as they do now with PPE. And also visitors, and that can't be ignored. You know, visitors are a very important part of nursing homes and for nursing home residents to be able to see their loved ones. And I just have a few images there of the types of, some of the decor that we're starting to see come in, and in terms of dementia care, and then the configuration. And I suppose if you look at the picture in the bottom right-hand corner, that might be the type of nursing home you might see going into the future, where you have quadrants, you have self-contained areas, and each of those quadrants, they have their own staff areas, their own entrance and exit. So there's minimal cross transfer of infection around the building. If we talk about investment then, and first of all, if we just step back from healthcare, and from a CBRE perspective, healthcare fits into what we call alternative real estate investment. So these sectors that you see here, this is what healthcare is up against in terms of the capital that's coming into Ireland. They're not just looking at healthcare, they're looking at each of the colours that you see there. So you've got self-storage, you've got data centres, for example, education development in Ireland. And these are all set aside from the regular investment platform, which would be, retail and offices, etc., logistics. So you can see nursing care there in the pink is growing each year, and you can see as well healthcare is in the dark green at the bottom. If we look at yields across Europe, then this chart shows that we've seen yield compression across each of the countries that I mentioned here up to 2020. And if we talk about transactions then in Ireland, so we've seen over the last 3 years more transactions than ever before in nursing homes. And I suppose it's a case of the sector has become more corporate, and we've seen a lot of consolidation. There's a lot of groups here now in Ireland present. There's a lot of capital coming in from Europe. We've seen single asset transactions that are mentioned here, and you can see some of the same names coming up again, some of the consolidators. And you can see on the bottom here, we have all of the group transactions that have happened, any of the portfolio sales or asset transfers. The latest one, Eimear, that was mentioned in the papers on Sunday. You only have to pick up the paper each Sunday, you see something to do with nursing homes. It's been extremely active. We now have 40% of private beds are now within groups, and that is the 22 groups that we refer to. And you can see them here in terms of how they lay out against each other in terms of their number of beds and their number of homes. So the leading up there in the top right-hand corner in terms of the number of beds and number of homes, the largest is Molam. Now, some of the homes within Molam, we understand, are under a management contract, so they're not necessarily owned or leased by Molam. And with all of the others, some of them, they are operators first and foremost, and they don't necessarily own the freeholds, or some of them are holdcos. And just to explain that point further, and this is something that Robert will touch on later in terms of the transactions that we've seen happening, we've seen two different types of transactions. We've seen holdco, wholly owned transfers of entire business companies, and we've seen sale and leasebacks. And if you look at the ones which are the wholly owned, we have a list there of the transactions that have happened, and you can see some of the familiar group names: CareChoice, Beachfield, Silverstream, DLC, Brindley and Eimear that was mentioned at the weekend. And then the sale and leasebacks that we've seen, and you'll see the same names coming up again. One particular French fund that's been very active, and another French fund that's also in Ireland. And if we look at the origin of each of this capital that's coming into Ireland in the nursing home space, it's quite interesting to see where the capital is coming from. We can see a lot of French flags there. We've also had investment from Germany, we have one Dutch fund here, and a lot of European cash coming in. So I'll hand back over to Vanessa now. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Maureen. I'm just going to leave my camera off temporarily because I think there's a little bit of flicker on the signal. But I just actually, in case I didn't get a chance to say it at the end of the last section, that there is a Q&A function on the webinar. And please feel free to pop your questions in there and we'll come to those at the end of the presentations. Okay, so Maureen, actually, I think that is so interesting, I think, in terms of the data that you've managed to pull together there. And there's a very interesting spread of ownership to my mind. And one question that kind of arises to, for me is, is there still room for the single home operator, or is this consolidation story compelling at this point?
I think there is still a bit more consolidation to happen, Vanessa, but there is, of course, there's plenty of very successful operators out there. There's, the mama and papa operations, the, perhaps the husband and wife team. And I suppose some of them now, they'll be looking at succession planning. They'll be looking at whether their children are looking to take over the business. It is definitely a seller's market at the moment. We know that there's a lot of investors looking at Ireland. There's a lot of existing groups here looking to consolidate further. So definitely there are opportunities. And for any existing operators in perhaps an older property that needs investment, that needs capex, they're working in a very regulated space, and they're watching HIQA guidelines, and they're watching, the deadlines such as December next year. And so I think for some of them, they may look to exit. But absolutely, there is definitely still a market there, and there's plenty of very successful individual operators.
The other point appeals to me on as a real estate lawyer is the valuation side of things. You mentioned the varying fair deal rates. How does this impact on valuations in your experience?
Yeah, fair deal. I mean, the thing is that if you look at the turnover in a nursing home, they're very much, it's fair deal rate by the number of weeks, by the occupancy. In Dublin, fair deal rates are higher, as I showed. The average is now 1,200 per week. So you've got a much better capacity there to increase your turnover. And also in Dublin and some other, affluent locations, you might have the ability to attract private paying residents. And perhaps a higher social charge. So you're starting from a better, a higher turnover position, I suppose. And then, when you look at the accounts of nursing home and you come down as far as EBITDA, and, it all comes down to economies of scale. So if you've got a better turnover and you've got a higher number of beds, you've obviously got the ability to create, to turn over a better EBITDA figure. Now, in terms of valuations, with going concern assets that we sell, they're sold on a multiple of EBITDA. And that typically, it used to be 10 times EBITDA for prime Dublin locations. And we saw that 10 times pushed up and up again over the last few years. So we've seen really keen multiples being paid on EBITDA for trading assets for nursing homes. In terms of the sale and lease backs, then there's a rent put in place as at the time of the sale and the lease back. And then the valuation is based on the yield on that rent.
Okay, and one point that occurred to me when we were looking at our notes for this presentation was, has COVID impacted on valuations negatively or positively?
I think what you'll see is, and unfortunately, COVID and COVID-related deaths within nursing homes, it was very much publicised in media. And, you could see at one point there was a list of which nursing homes have been worst affected. And actually, if you looked at that list, some of the best operators were there. Some of the best well-known and renowned nursing homes in the country were on the top of that list. I think COVID has not necessarily impacted values, and we've still seen a very healthy deal flow within the nursing home space. But what it has done is it's created much greater scrutiny for investors. They're looking at buildings in much greater detail. They're looking at doubles, all the points I mentioned in terms of space and the percentage of doubles and space for social distancing and for compartmentalizing areas within the nursing home, the ability to isolate. Obviously, if you've got a lot of double beds, your occupancy is going to be significantly impacted, because when you take a new resident in, they need to be in a single room to isolate for the first kind of 14 days. So yeah, valuations, I suppose it comes down to property, a lot more scrutiny on property now after COVID.
Thanks, Maureen. Robert, I'm going to bring you in now in terms of the legal structures that we're seeing in the transactions that we're working on. I think one of the things that I really like about working in the nursing home sector is it's such an interesting combination of, there's the physical property assets, and then there's the trading business attached to it, which is something that, brings a lot of elements to the structuring side. where are you seeing most common deal structures kind of falling?
Thanks, Vanessa. So we're seeing really a mix of different deal structures. I think, as Maureen has mentioned, I would say most of the transactions we're seeing in the nursing home space do separate the PropCo and OpCo. So we're seeing a separation of the freehold property with the rest of the business and the operating business, which also has its own, has its own value and its own document in that respect. I mean, that can happen whether you're acquiring the shares or the assets. So I think that the starting point for a kind of the corporate deal is, are you acquiring the relevant company under a share purchase agreement, or are you acquiring the assets and you're picking and choosing the assets? So that is, acquiring the goodwill of the operating company, and you do that under a business transfer agreement. And there's quite a lot of issues to think about in terms of which of those you go with. So I think those are some of the key things. I think what we sometimes see is a slightly different approach then in terms of some sort of put and call arrangements that can be put in place, under which if the group hits a certain EBITDA threshold, for instance, then there's a right to acquire or a right to force the operator to acquire. And that can work in various ways in terms of the freehold property. But typically, Vanessa, it is it's a split between the PropCo and the OpCo with a third party investor acquiring the property. And I know there's various tax advantages to doing that. What we do see as well is particularly where there's a share purchase agreement. So you're buying the shares in a company. The difficulty, I think, sometimes that can be perceived with that from a buyer's perspective is that you're acquiring everything. So if there's an historic liability that arises subject to your terms of your transaction, that will be for the buyer's account, so to speak. So one of the things from that perspective and from a tax perspective that we sometimes see as well is a pre-sale reorganization, under which the existing the existing trade of the company is passed to a new company, and the shares in that company are then bought. I suppose that allows the buyer to pay stamp duty at 1% rather than a higher rate. So we see a mix of things really, but there's certainly a few trends there, Vanessa.
And in terms of impact of the pandemic on transactions, did that severely impact deal flow, or is that kind of working its way through now?
Yeah, so it did. I mean, I'd say, I think what Maureen said in terms of the last 2 to 3 years of things being very busy on the nursing home transaction side is certainly in keeping with our experience as well. And obviously we've worked with Maureen on some of those, of course. But so I think absolutely earlier this year, when the crisis hit in kind of March time, I would say there were transactions we were involved with that paused. And I'd say there wasn't a massive flow for a number of months at that stage. That definitely has changed very much since the summer, as the summer went on. And I would say right now, in terms of what we're seeing, it's as active as, or more active than I've ever seen it, in terms of opportunities that are ongoing, even not necessarily ones that would have signed yet or be public knowledge, but certainly the sense we're getting is that there's a big and there are new, potentially even new operators coming to the country, and acquirers and funds and that sort of thing, as well as the existing players being active. So it's very much active now. And I think it has changed certain things in the transactions. And I would say that acquirers and operators and funds, it's still not, I mean, COVID's, it's not the main point on the transactions. It's not focused upon heavily, but at the same time, it is an area of due diligence and a very specific area of due diligence, and how that's, how everything that's happened in a given nursing home with a given group of nursing homes that is the target, how everything has played out is certainly one of the things to be discussed and covered in the deal documents, and that can go to specific protection, in terms of the purchaser being comforted that a past liability isn't going to be for their account. So it's certainly very relevant, but very strong deal flow at the moment, I would say.
And in terms of common deal issues that you're experiencing, in terms of, I mean, the particulars of the COVID is one thing, but there's, in all the types of deals we're doing in terms of share purchase, business transfers, and so there's kind of common issues that come up, or kind of pitfalls that people can fall in. You know, what are those?
Yeah, so I think obviously one of the big things there, Vanessa, we would see a huge mix in the transactions that we do in the nursing home space. We would see a huge mix in how ready the sellers are for a sale. So in some instances, you encounter this very, very well prepared room sellers who understand how the deal will work and understand the sorts of questions that, you know, the various advisors will ask in their different areas, tax and legal and so forth. And the deal generally, when that happens, runs very, very quickly and very smoothly. We see other situations in which, really, in fairness, I think the sellers probably don't understand what's coming in terms of what the process involves and the level of, what an investor will want to know about and the sorts of questions their lawyers and their accountants will ask and their tax advisors. So we do see delays when that's the situation, and it's understandable, of course, that it would sometimes, if somebody hasn't transacted before, how would they? But it's certainly something that we do see, and where there's a heavy reliance on the director of nursing, for instance, to answer in a given nursing home all of the questions that are being asked. That can be difficult because obviously the person can't just drop their day-to-day duties to answer everything. And certainly we see that in those sorts of issues arising. I think more specifically then on the deal itself, there are due diligence matters that come up again and again on nursing home transactions. I think data protection is one. I think issues around employment law and agency workers, that sort of thing can come up. Leaving aside COVID, certainly we see, and sorry, these things I'm mentioning don't sort of, they don't kill a deal. They just kind of cause delays and can cause issues. And certainly momentum on any transaction is a huge thing. If you begin to cause delays, it does go to deal certainty and reducing that. So we do see some of those things. I mean, there's also health issues can come up quite suddenly. Some sort of health concern. We saw that long before COVID became an issue. Just in terms of some sort of illness arising in a nursing home. And obviously what we see with investors and acquirers is that they will want to understand that, of course, and it can just cause a little bit of a delay as an issue can be worked through. I think obviously Eimear's going to speak a little bit about HIQA. That's certainly one thing that arise as well. I think other things on deal terms, completion accounts, that sort of thing, particularly where there's a business transfer agreement and the parties sort of working out exactly how that's going to work. And I think certainly in all these deals, Vanessa, as you'll back me up on, it's I think on property issues, certainly those issues can sort of be, you're at the mercy of third parties a little bit more maybe than on some of the operating issues. So I think sometimes those sorts of things can also lead to delay. And the other one then in terms of third parties is probably existing bank facilities, making sure that the process with the relevant banks is advanced nice and early and the relevant people are engaged. So those are the sorts of things.
Yeah. Can you just touch, Robert, briefly on the CCPC requirements, the competition law approvals that can sometimes arise?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that is generally will be more relevant to the bigger operators, but it's very important that people are, the different operators are aware of it, because you are required to go and get an antitrust consent if the turnover of the buyer and the target group exceed at certain thresholds individually and then combined. So what's required there is for you to have to go and make a notification if the buyer group has more than 10 million euro of turnover in Ireland, and if the target group has more than 10 million euro of turnover in Ireland, and if combined they have turnover of at least 60 million. And when I say turnover, I mean in the most recent full financial year. So obviously in some situations that's not going to be relevant, but particularly as we see operators grow their portfolio, it's one to be very careful of. And again, as well, sometimes on these transactions, as we've talked about, there's a split of the freehold property, and you just have to look at how that's calculated in situations where a fund, for instance, is acquiring freehold property, and there's more than just the two parties involved, so to speak. So, you know, it's something, if it comes up in a deal, it's a split signing and closing, and you have to get that consent before you can close the transaction. So it's just an extra thing to factor in.
What impacts on timing, yes. Eimear, can I bring you in now, actually, because I think HIQA is the regulator that applies in nursing home scenarios, and you have a lot of experience in advising in relation to how the HIQA requirements impact on the different types of nursing home transaction. Can you just bring us through what are the kind of typical scenarios that we meet with HIQA?
Yes, Vanessa. When advising clients in relation to the sale or purchase of a nursing home, we always look at what are the consent or notification requirements specific to that industry, to that sector. And obviously here the HIQA and the NTPF, or the fair deal, as Maureen referred to earlier, spring to mind. These requirements are going to vary depending on the structure of the transaction. And for example, if the buyer is acquiring shares in the current registered provider of the nursing home, this is not going to amount to a change of ownership. This is not going to amount to a change of registered provider, but you do often find that the buyer will want to make certain changes in the, to the board of the registered provider, or maybe change the secretary or senior management. And these types of changes will trigger the filing of a notification to HIQA. The HIQA regulations provide that this notification must be done by filing a form NF33A, and it also states that this form must be filed 8 weeks in advance of the change taking place. So while this isn't a consent requirement as such, it is important that it is considered, and that the form is filed, and that we often build in the timeline or the specific requirement into the SPA. While we also have to look at the NTPF deed here, because even though there's no change of registered provider, there is in the standard form, fair deal or NTPF deed, there is a clause saying that where a notification of the change in the registered provider details is filed with HIQA, a similar notification must be made to the NTPF within 30 days. So practically speaking, we usually advise clients to try and do both notifications at the same time, so that there's no issue or nothing falls between the cracks. Where there is a business transfer and the assets and the business of the registered provider are actually being transferred to the buyer, this will trigger a full new application by the buyer to be registered as the registered provider of the nursing home. So this is the long application. It typically takes about 4 months, but we have seen this application being processed by HIQA a lot quicker, particularly in 2019. This is more of a consent application, and it also requires the current registered provider of the nursing home to give consent to HIQA to allow HIQA to engage with the proposed buyer in relation to its application. Where there's a change of registered provider, then you do need to look at the NTPF deed a little bit more carefully, because that's going to be in the name of the current registered provider. So there, from a buyer's perspective, you will want to see an NTPF deed in the name of the buyer to be effective as of completion. So what usually happens is the seller will engage with the NTPF and tell them what's happening, and a new NTPF deed will be issued on the exact same terms and conditions and for the expiry of the term of the NTPF deed, but it will just have the name of the new provider and the new registered provider on the deed. We haven't had any issues with this in the past, and the NTPF have been very accommodating on past transactions. Finally, and while it mightn't affect all nursing home transactions, if there are agreements with the HSE, these do need to be looked at, because you can find that there are notification obligations within those agreements. From our experience, they have a kind of a restructuring or a reorganisation clause that requires notification after the restructuring or the reorganisation has happened. but it does allow the HSE a period of time. I think it's about 3 months generally, to take a view on the restructuring, and if it considers that the restructuring or the reorganisation may adversely impact the services being provided under the agreement, they do have a right to terminate that agreement. So that's an important one that we would advise the buyer to keep an eye on after completion of the transaction.
Thanks, Eimear. Maureen, can I bring you back in now, actually, because one of the topics that I think is interesting is, you know, how Ireland compares with Europe at this stage in terms of, you know, we're seeing, as you mentioned, all the entry of a lot of European funds. Is there a critical size that those groups are looking for in terms of capacity, bed capacity, and how is that going to impact our market?
Yeah, Vanessa, most of the groups that come to talk to us when they're looking to establish in Ireland, they want 1,000 beds. And, you know, we are only a small market. It's very, very difficult to acquire 1,000 beds in Ireland. There's some of them that would look at acquiring a smaller portfolio and perhaps looking at some greenfield sites for development. So, yeah, we do get a mix, but the scale, I think, you know, the investors need to think about, you know, the size of Ireland, the size of our market. Obviously, it is going to be growing. But yeah, scale is obviously one, and that comes down to their head office as well. So when you've got a very, you know, all of the groups and the groups that you saw on my slides, they've got a very solid head office structure, and that's really important in terms of operating the portfolios in Ireland, in terms of their, not just their financial control and, you know, all of their operations, but it's also in terms of their governance. And when I spoke about HIQA, I only spoke about property and the premises. There's also a huge amount in terms of clinical governance.
Actually, I'm just going to pick up, I can see quite a few questions have come in on the Q&A, and one that kind of repeatedly comes up, and it's one that you and I have touched on amongst ourselves, Maureen, is the question of new build and development of new nursing homes. Because actually, certainly in my experience on the real estate side, I can see that of the nursing homes we're transacting, those that have the capacity for extensions are really prized, highly prized. And we're also seeing increasingly brand new greenfield new builds. What's your experience, Maureen, in the viability of new build, new development?
Yeah, definitely, Vanessa. It's important to remember the cost of development. So this time last year, the sort of published cost that used to be referred to by the leading retail banks was 165,000 per bed. We have now seen that come down slightly. That's based on recent tenders on a live project that we're aware of. And I think what's also important is that values have crept up in the meantime. So we've now seen a better equilibrium in terms of build cost reducing slightly and values pushing upwards. But that still doesn't make greenfield developments outside of Dublin or outside of Dublin and the sort of Dublin area that I mentioned. It's still very difficult to find, to have a positive value and for it to be viable to actually develop outside Dublin. I think what we've seen as well is we've seen a lot of developments become quite large because, you know, obviously operators are trying to find economies of scale with building. The newest nursing home that we're going to see opening soon is over 200 beds. I think it's up at about 220. So we're, you know, it's getting into very large territory. There's obviously pros and cons to smaller nursing homes versus larger, but I think it's important, as I mentioned before, to keep in mind all of what I mentioned in terms of HIQA standards and compartmentalization of areas and thinking about infection control and, you know, the makeup of the building.
So bigger isn't necessarily better.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, if you have a regulatory issue, this is what our neighbours over in the UK mentioned, that at one point in the UK, they did go towards that much bigger model, and they found that if there was regulatory issues, it was spread across a much, much larger property, and the impact was greater, obviously. So they've actually gone back, and you can see on my slide in terms of the average size. The average size in the UK of a nursing home is about 53 beds. Now, it's a very different framework there in terms of, you know, they have care homes and nursing homes, and they have a different fee structure, but definitely their homes are smaller, and we are starting to see, we're seeing larger developments for any of the new developments are happening, but that's also because the newer developments tend to be in Dublin or the greater Dublin area at the moment.
And do we think, you know, is there a need for some incentive program to encourage development in these areas that maybe are not purely financially viable?
Yeah, I think it would be great to see, if we think back to 2006, there was the hotel, there was a need for better hotel stock in Ireland, and to improve our tourist figures, because we saw obviously that Ireland was such a, great resource in terms of attracting visitors. And there was an accelerated capital allowances scheme brought in. It stimulated a lot of development, and it was a really successful scheme by all means. And I think it would be wonderful to see something like that brought in terms of nursing homes, or something on the VAT piece, because VAT, obviously healthcare businesses are not VAT registered, so they can't claim back VAT. Yes. So when we look at development costs and we talk about the 155,000 per bed, there's no, you can't claim back any of the VAT on that construction. So I think there's one or two things that possibly government could look at, and we would be really welcomed by the sector.
Maureen, the other thing that I think would be of interest to our audience is the issue of kind of senior care and senior living developments. This is something that is much bigger across Europe. It barely exists here. Why is that?
Well, Vanessa, I'm glad you didn't say the word retirement, because there's a lot of retirement schemes around Ireland that just haven't worked. And yeah, there is definitely a really great attachment in Ireland to property and land, as we know. And people are often very reluctant to leave the family home. I think what's very important to point out is that any kind of senior living or supported living is not a substitution for a nursing home. So when somebody needs nursing home care, it's because an event has happened. They've had a heart attack or a stroke or a fall or broke a hip, or they've, very advanced dementia. So an independent living unit is not going to suit those people. They need nursing care. What we would be welcomed in Ireland would be some better sort of framework in terms of senior living, independent living for people who are prepared to move from their own home. There is currently, I think that in terms of tax and how the Fair Deal scheme is treated, cash assets are treated in a different way from the family home. So it doesn't, I think if you dispose of the family home and then you go into a nursing home, that the cash asset that you have left over from that sale is treated for a much longer period. It's treated forever, whereas the family home or house asset is treated just for 3 years in terms of the government Fair Deal scheme. So yeah, again, possibly some intervention to try to improve and see how we could get that senior living off the ground, because it is, as you say, very successful in other countries.
One question that's come through from our audience is about capacity constraints in terms of clinical care staff, and how I mean, obviously, I don't think, Maureen, you can answer that necessarily, but that's something I think you and I would be aware of in terms of speaking to our clients, that is a real issue, isn't it? In terms of, how.
Yeah, and I think it tends to be more, well, often healthcare assistant staff tend to be very difficult to come by. I think we did see, obviously, since COVID, apparently there has been a shift in terms of, applications for young people coming out of school or college level, and whether they're considering now more so than ever going into healthcare or some facet of healthcare. So, but definitely in terms of skills as well, it's not just the availability of people, it's actually the skills. And we have people coming in from other countries, coming from various different countries around the world to come to Ireland to work in healthcare. Some of them are more ready and able to hit the ground than others. So it comes down to, it's capacity and skill as well.
Eimear, can I ask you a question actually on HIQA, which is, we talked at the top of, in the middle of Robert's piece in relation to internal reorganisations. Do they require HIQA consent and notifications?
Yeah, if there's a change of registered provider, even if that's within an internal, an internal change within the group, they will also require the full-blown change of registered provider application. But as I mentioned earlier, we do see those applications being processed quite quickly, because it's kind of maybe a sort of an artificial change of registered provider. It's actually just the company name moving from one group company to, the registered providing moving from one group company to another. So they're generally not problematic, but they do need to be built into the timelines involved, and it's just something that the clients need to be aware of.
Eimear. The other kind of change that's happening in the market, and one of our questions has come in more in relation to the Fair Deal for home care and the living at home care. What impact do you think that will have on supply and demand in the nursing home sector? Maureen, sorry, that's to you.
I think it would be great to see anything to encourage and to make to have more supports there. I think there's a lot of home care happens around the country, but it's not regulated. I think there's definitely a need for it. As I mentioned, a lot of people, want to. As a result, obviously, people are going into nursing homes with much higher dependency at a much later stage in life.
Thank you, Maureen. Going to leave it there. We've a lot of questions, and I think what we've elected to do is we'll kind of stay on time today, everybody, because we're having a little bit of technical difficulties, which is why you're not seeing many of us at this point. But what we are going to do is we have recorded the session. We will have the slides available to share with the group, and where we haven't picked up on any of the questions, the team will respond to those questions and issue that with our post-webinar follow-up. So thank you very much to our panelists, in particular to Maureen, who I think has had to work especially hard today. We had a lot of questions in your direction, Maureen, but also thank you to Robert and Eimear for joining us. And thank you. We've had a great attendance today, a lot of people joining us. So it's obviously a subject, while quite niche, has it's piqued interest in people who maybe aren't necessarily someone who are working in the sector, or maybe those who are interested in it as an alternative investment. So thank you very much, and we'll follow up with you with the slides and so on afterwards. Bye-bye.